Jeff. Just wanted to say a big thank you to Jeff and Deb and the Lake County Art League for having me. So I'm honored to be here and looking forward to doing this demonstration. Hope everyone enjoys it. And like Jeff said, please feel free to ask questions at any point as I go through. I totally welcome that. And let me show you what I'll be doing. Jeff asked me to do a portrait. And so I found this photo from a photo shoot that I did of a portrait commission back in the day, and one of my favorite ones from past years that I did, and it's a dapper gentleman named David, and you'll see I've already got the drawing here just to save time tonight, but I'm going to go through the rest of my process, and I'll get as much done as I can in the time that I have, and show you how I think through my process for trying to capture something that hopefully captures a decent likeness, as well as capturing light and shadow and color. And then I've got my palette right here. And this is you may be familiar with the Zorn palette. And it's the palette that was made famous by the Swedish painter Anders Zorn. And his palette was just 4 colors. And I've added this one right here. So let me go through these colors real quick. This is permanent red light, which is basically a cadmium red light. Zorn would have used vermilion, but this is really similar, like a permanent or cadmium red light. And then I have yellow ochre. This is ivory black and titanium zinc white. And the color that I've added is transparent oxide red. It's like a very dark, rich, transparent, and very warm burnt sienna. But it's transparent oxide red. And I find this color really useful for getting a lot of warmth in the deep shadows. And if you only use black, there's nothing wrong with that, but you've got to add red or something else that's warm so your deep shadows don't get too cold. So that's why I like the transparent oxide red. So those are my 4 colors that I'm going to be, or 5 colors that I'm going to be using. And the first thing that I like to do is to look at the subject, and I squint at it with my eyes partway closed. So I'm looking at the subject like this, just kind of squint down. And my first analysis that I'm trying to make is my darkest color and my lightest color. And when you squint down, it helps to see what is the very darkest and lightest colors in the whole scene. And this is going to be really important, as I'll talk about as we go along. So the darkest colors in this, I would say, are some of these deep shadows in the hair here. Right there's very dark. There's a couple of dark spots in the eye, but those are fairly small shapes. So it's going to be a little easier to get these larger ones. It's also pretty dark in the background here. I'm not going to go that dark in my painting, just making that choice here. So I would say the darkest tones in the photo are right here, and maybe a little bit in the shadow right there. So, oh, and I should mention that my tone that I have on my panel is a mixture of the transparent oxide red and the ivory black. And same thing for my drawing. I've used just a little bit of transparent oxide red and black with just a little bit of medium. And that's what this is right here, just to make the paint a little bit more fluid. And that helps me to get the drawing on there quicker. And I also use just a little bit of medium in my tone. I don't use a lot of medium for the rest of the painting, only in that first drawing stage, but you might see me reach for it. I've got it right here. And what it is 4 parts Gamsol, which is Gamblin's odorless mineral spirits, 4 parts Gamsol, and 1 part stand oil. That's what I've got there. Probably won't use it very much. And in here I have Gamsol, and I use that for rinsing my brushes if I go from like a really dark color to a really light color, or vice versa. I'll rinse off my brush in between. So I may use that as well. Okay, I think that pretty much covers my materials and my very first step, which is going to be to mix a nice, warm, dark. And this is going to be very, very dark. Oh, sorry. Got to get the camera on my palette. And so I'm using transparent oxide red and black. And once again, that transparent oxide red is just warming up the black. So it's a very, very dark, warm, rich black. And I'm going to get a decently large brush. This is a soft mongoose hair brush. I usually use soft brushes for this part, and I think I will add just the tiniest bit of medium to make the paint just a little more fluid. But you could use a sable brush or anything like that. And I just like to keep my darks relatively
Hey,
thin.
Adam,
Uh-huh.
a quick
Yes.
question for you.
Yeah.
What is that you're using as a palette? It looks to me like it's a piece of like plywood or something.
Yeah, this is just my desktop, so it's wooden, but then I've got a piece of plexiglass
Ah,
over the top of it. And
okay,
I prefer glass, and so I'm looking to replace it with glass because then I can use my glass scraper to clean it off. But this is just plexiglass over wood.
okay.
Hmm. And I'm just going to get these dark parts in there. And this is what this is doing by getting these dark tones in really early on in the process. It's just helping me to visualize the very darkest tones, and then I'm going to add the very lightest as well. And it just establishes in the very beginning that range of value, that range of darks and lights. Then I know that all my other tones and darks and lights are going to fall between the very darkest and the very lightest. And so it helps me to stay on track. And the reason why this is important, as I'll talk about as I go through this, is for the purpose of form. I want his portrait to look three-dimensional. And you notice in the photo, it's very evident that we have light coming from our right, his left. One side of the face is lighter, the other side is darker. So I have to pay attention to these darks and lights in order to show the three-dimensional form as well as the effect of the light on his face. If I don't pay attention to that, his portrait is just going to look flat. And so if you've ever run into a situation where it just doesn't look like it has three-dimensional form, but your subject looks flat, probably, 95% of the time it's some issue with value where you need to go a little lighter or a little darker. But I established my extremes in the beginning, the darkest dark and now the lightest light. And that's the first step to getting these values. So coming back to my palette here, I'm just going to paint that collar. I think I'm going to paint that pure white. And talking about the brightest part of his collar there. And maybe I'll add, it does have a bit of a cool tone to it though, so I might add just a touch of black, but it really doesn't matter. It's gonna pretty much just be pure white here. And I will get a nice big brush. Let's see. Got this guy right here. This is a medium-sized bristle brush, and it allows me to really load it up and get a lot of paint on there. I don't mind if the paint goes on thicker with this part, but I like to use the mongoose or a sable brush for the darks because then they can lie flat and they're not going to catch too much light because I want those to be nice and dark. But this can be nice and bright, this part here. So I don't mind if it's a little thicker, and I don't mind if the ridges of my paint are thick and catch a little bit more light. That's all right with this part. Okay, so I'm just going to get that on just like that. And now I've established my darkest dark and my lightest light. And once again, I know that all my other tones are going to fit somewhere between those two extremes. And the key for seeing how dark or how light is once again to squint. So now for every value, for every shade of dark and light that I paint, I'm going to be squinting down at the subject and asking myself, how much darker or lighter is this value compared to my very darkest and my very lightest? And then the more values that I get in the picture, the more that I have to compare to. And so for every new value, I'm always squinting and analyzing and asking myself, how much darker or lighter is this value than a value I've already established? And then I try to mix it and get it just right. And working systematically through the piece helps me to establish that three-dimensional form so my portrait doesn't look flat. And of course, you could apply this to any subject, still life, landscape, or anything. So there's my lightest light and my darkest dark. And from here, I'm squinting down and asking myself, where do I want to go from here? And I think what I'd like to do is block in the shadow side of David's face here. And there's a lot going on. It's not just one value, but I am going to paint it with one general average value for everything in the shadow. And then I'll probably paint everything that's in the light of his face as a separate tone as well. So his whole face will be in 2 or 3 values, you'll see as I go. And that's just how I start out before I get more specific with the portrait. So this just helps me to simplify what would otherwise be a much more complicated subject, being a human face, but I simplify it into these more manageable steps. So it's a very reddish skin tone. Let me go back to the photo there. Very reddish skin tone. So, but I don't want it to be too red. So I'm actually just kind of starting with this transparent oxide red. And let's see what happens if I just add a little bit of white. And before I get real specific with the color, once again, I want to pay attention to the value. And that's really the most important thing before I get the specific color is I want to determine how dark or how light is it. Because once again, that's really going to be the thing that's going to help me to establish a three-dimensional look to the portrait. And so what I'm doing is I'm squinting down at my subject, at the photo, and I'm asking myself, I'm trying to paint this shadow that goes all the way down on our left, his right, and I'm squinting, I'm asking myself, how much lighter is this shadow, particularly right here, compared to that darkest dark right there? When you squint down, you can actually tell that those values are they're pretty similar. And so even though he's not a dark-skinned individual, but this part is in shadow. So it's quite dark compared to that deepest dark. So on my palette, I want to stay true to that, and I don't want to go too light with this mixture. So I'm adding a little bit of, I added a little bit of black and white, but it's mostly that transparent oxide red. And now that's going to be quite reddish. So I want to tone that down with the color's complement. So if it's too red, the complement of red, or the color on the opposite side of the color wheel, is green. And I don't have a green on my palette, do I? But with the Zorn palette, it's very, very versatile. So if I mix yellow and black together, see how compared to the other colors, it looks like you can get a green. And that's plenty green to counteract the redness in this mixture. So I'm going to get something that's about the same value. So I'm adding more black, and then I'm just going to add a little bit of that to my mixture to try to see if I can cut down on the strength of that red in the mixture. Okay. So that's looking pretty good to me. Maybe I'll add just a little bit of yellow ochre, just like that. And now I'm thinking, maybe I went a little too far. Maybe it needs to have a little bit more red chroma to it. Well, I can just add a little bit more red. So using a limited palette like this is really helpful because it minimizes your decision making. If I'm trying to choose between 12 different colors on my palette, it makes the process a lot harder. So I will use this a lot for portraits. With other subjects or in other situations where I have more time to paint, I might have a very full palette with quite a number of colors, but the Zorn palette is great, and it gives you a very full range of color to work with as well. So it's a limited palette, but it will not limit you as an artist. That's what I like to tell people. Okay, so now that I've got that color, I'm gonna get a pretty decently large brush. This is a number 8 bristle brush, so I can get plenty of paint on it. And let's test out this color. I'm going to put it right next to that dark. And I'm asking myself, does that look like about the relationship that I'm seeing in the photo? Yeah, it's not too bad. It's definitely not too light. I'm sorry, it's definitely not too dark. I might have it just a touch too light, but I'm going to go with it. I'm going to go with it and see where we end up with it, okay? And what I'm going to do is everywhere that his face is in shadow, I'm going to put this value. Now, of course, in the photo, there's a lot more going on, a lot more detail and subtle shifts of dark and light within this big shadow shape of his face. But I'm not worrying about any of those things right now. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. And I'm just thinking in terms of painting all of the shadow on his face with one average tone, one general average color and value. And we'll get a little bit in here, and I'm going to come down here on the neck and put that same basic tone here. And I'll add more detail and more variations as I go along, but this gives me a good start and a very quick start to be able to block in this whole area kind of as one big connected shape. So you'll see I left a little bit there for where his mustache is going to go, but all of that is in shadow. And when I squint down, I can see that this part is in shadow as well. So even though it's on the right-hand side of the face, you might think it would be lighter, but the eyeball is, of course, a rounded form, and so the right-hand side of it is lighter. And then as those forms turn away from the light source, it's getting a little darker on the right-hand side. So if you squint down, that's a lot more evident. This little triangle right here on the cheek, that's a little bit iffy. That it's probably shadow, but it's just not as dark as this shadow over here. So I'm going to leave it for right now, with the exception of maybe just a little bit right there. And then right underneath the lower lip, I'll block that in as well. Okay, there we go. So already, just by keeping that darker, we're starting to get a sense of light and shadow. Even though I haven't painted anything on the lit side of his face, just by keeping that darker, we're already starting to get an idea of three-dimensional form. So this is what I like to do in the beginning, and there's nothing worse than, you know, zeroing in on some detail like the eye or the mouth or something and doing all this hard work, and then you step back from the portrait and you realize that, oh man, I should have painted that entire region much darker in order to show the light and shadow. So that's why I like to do this as a foundational stage, the light and the shadow first, and then the detail on top. So now that I have one basic tone for the shadow, I want to do the same thing for the lit side of his face. And I'm just going to do an average tone and color for that side as well. So I'm going to start out with white, and I have to mention that I'm still relying on that technique of squinting. I'm looking right here in particular where his cheek and his jaw is, and I'm squinting down at the photo and asking myself how much darker is that part of his flesh compared to the pure white of the collar. And there's definitely a jump there. But then I also want to compare it to the shadow side and get the contrast between the light and shadow on his face as well. So I'm shooting for something that kind of approximates the value for the light side of his face. It has to be somewhere between the white and the shadow of the face. So let's see if I can get something that'll work well. And I'm starting out with white. And I'm just going to be adding red, probably a little bit of all my other colors, to be honest. Red and yellow ochre. He does have a ruddy complexion, but there's always going to be some measure of red and yellow in flesh. At least when you have a somewhat natural light on the subject, there's always going to be some measure of yellow and red. And some people, of course, have more of one than the other. But that's really the key, is to find that relationship between the yellow and red. Okay, so I've got something here that's clearly lighter than the shadow that I just painted, but it's a lot darker than pure white. And so I think this might work pretty well. I never know for sure until I get it up there, but let's just see what this looks like. And I'm guessing I'll probably need more of that color, but that's okay. I'll mix a little bit more if I have to. Okay, so I'm going to get a different brush now, and why don't I use, I'll use this guy right here. This is really a large one, a number 12. I always use the bigger brushes in the beginning, smaller brushes at the end as I go along. Okay, so I'm just going to get that color on there. It's a little bit yellowish actually. So I'm going to come back to the color on my palette and wipe off my brush. And I want a little higher proportion of the red in there. And I might even add a touch of the black just to gray it down a little bit, okay? The ivory black actually has some blue pigment in it. And that's how you can kind of get these greens when I'm mixing it with yellow. And you kind of get a purple when you mix it with red. So let me just show you that real quick. And this is just again to demonstrate the range that you can get with the Zorn palette. Again, I don't always use the Zorn palette, but it is great and it gives a surprising range of color. I mean, look at that purple right there. You just wouldn't expect that, but you can get a really nice purple with the red and the black, which again contains a little blue pigment, so that's why it's making purple, and a bit of the white. And this can be really useful for mixing in a little bit with the skin tone if you see it going a little bit cooler or what have you. But what I'm using it for now is to make the skin tone less yellow because purple is the complement to yellow. And so if I add the complement to this mixture, just a little bit of it, it's going to make that mixture less yellow. Just like when I had something a minute ago, the shadow was too red, and I added the complement of green to make it less red. I'm doing the same principle here, making this a little bit less yellow by adding the complement. Okay, now I've also made it a touch darker, and I don't necessarily want that, so I'm going to add back in just a little bit of white. And now I'm just going to try it out and see how it looks. I want to wipe that old color off my brush real good so it doesn't mix too much with the new version. And we'll come back here and let's see how that compares. Yeah, it's a little better. I'm going to take my palette knife and scrape off the old color once again so it doesn't mix too much. And I'll just come in like this, and everywhere where the light is hitting his face, I'm going to put this lighter color. Now, once again, there's a lot more going on in terms of a little darker here, a little lighter there, but I'm trying not to get distracted by that. What I'm doing right now is building the foundation of my portrait, and I like to do that in just 2 or 3 values if I can. And this just simplifies the process so much, and it'll set you up in the beginning to have a portrait that looks like it's 3-dimensional so that you don't have to go back and fix that later after you've spent a lot of time on the detailed parts. I'm going to bring that light up this way as well. There's a lot of color variety where some areas go more pink, some areas go maybe a little bit more olive, and I do that in a later stage. I don't let myself get distracted by any of that right now because I'm just trying to have a laser focus on value. That's really my primary my primary goal in this stage. Okay, and then this part as well on the front of the forehead is also receiving light, but it's generously darker than this area that I was painting over here. So I am going to paint a third value or mix a third value for those areas. Those are the halftones. So they're still in the light, but they're angled away from the light so that they are significantly darker than, say, the cheek that's facing the light more directly. And there's a few areas of halftone that I want to get in. But if you look at the photo, you'll see this line that I painted right here, and that's where the light ends and the shadow begins. That's called the terminator, and that terminator runs down like this, and then down the bridge of the nose, and then it kind of angles over. There's a little triangular part on the front of the nose that's still receiving a little bit of light. So that's the halftone region, but that terminator is the boundary between light and shadow, and that runs down like this, that, like that, and then down on the chin. So I try to pay attention to that once again to separate these lights from these shadows. And even though I only have 2 values, you can get the effect of 3-dimensionality really early on in your portrait. And that's going to be a great way to give you a good foundation for the remaining part of the painting. All right, so let me come back to my palette, and I'm going to mix up a separate skin tone that is in between the light and the shadow. And this is going to serve as that halftone, those halftone regions, which are still part of the light family, but they're a little bit darker than what I was just painting a second ago. All right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix similar colors together, but I'm shooting for a value that's in between the light and shadow values. So white and transparent oxide red until I get about the right value. Okay, so that looks like about the right value, but it's very, very reddish. So I'm going to tone that down again with this green that I have. We'll cut that down with the green, which once again is the yellow ochre and the black. And then it still looks like a pretty strong orangey color, although I think I'm pretty happy with the value. But it's a pretty strong yellow orange at this point, so I need to gray it down just a little bit so it looks like a little bit more natural skin tone. And so I'm going to add that that purple with just a touch of white. I probably have a little too much white there, but let me mix a little bit of that together and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, I do kind of see like a pinkish purple hue also to some of the halftones. So I'm gonna use that purple, but also mix in just a touch of my red as well. And now we're zeroing in on a value in a color that I think will look pretty natural. But I'll test it out on my canvas and we'll see if it looks good. And if not, we can always adjust it. No big deal. Okay, so I'm gonna come back to this other brush that's a little smaller. It's a filbert bristle brush. And so far I've been using all bristle brushes because they're coarse and they can really pick up a lot of paint. For this block-in stage, I just like to get as much paint on the surface as I can. With the exception of these dark shadows, I like those to lie a little flatter. And so that's why I use my mongoose brush for that. Okay, so I'm just wiping the old color off of this real good, and then I'll load up with this halftone mixture that I just created. And now let's see if I start putting this in on this frontal plane of the forehead. I'm going to block this in and then step back from my work and see, does it look about right? And yeah, I think that's starting to look okay. It's definitely darker than the lights that I have over here, but lighter than the shadow. And so we can tell that there's some form there, some turning of the form. And I think that's going to work okay. It does look a little yellow again. And so I'm just going to add a little bit more red. And you'll notice this time I'm just mixing with my brush. I can't mix as much this way, but it is a quick way to alter the color, just with some red, black, and white to get kind of more of a pinkish look. And get rid of that yellow. Let's see. I'm not going to bother to scrape it off. I'll just go on top. See how this looks. All right. And then I'm going to come in here with that little triangular area there. And then right here on the bridge of the nose and that little triangle on the front of the nose, go a little darker there as well. I see this value right here on the upper lip and some right in here as well. Okay. Okay, now at this stage, what I'm going to try to do is give a little bit more. I've got my basic values pretty much where I want them, but at this point now, I would like to have some different color variations in the skin because it's not all the same color. In some places, it goes a little bit more pink. In some places, it goes a little cooler, a little warmer. And particularly on the bridge of the nose, it does go warmer. So you'll notice I'm keeping within the same value of this midtone right here, but I'm just heating it up a lot with the red and the transparent oxide red, which are both very warm colors. And I just want to come right in here and add a little bit of a variation of a warmer color. I see that right here on the wing of the nostril as well. It gets quite warm. And I'm just looking around to see some other areas that might take that. It's a little bit more reddish on the lips, though not nearly as strong as those other two places. Does anyone have any questions yet? Feel free to unmute yourself if you do. When I'm doing these demos or working from life, I tend to go very, very fast. And so,
Adam, what kind of paint are you using? What brand?
okay, yeah, so it's all oil paint. I can't remember if I actually said that, but let's see. I have Rembrandt, and actually all of these are Rembrandt except this one is Gamblin. So that's the titanium zinc from Gamblin, and all the other ones are Rembrandt. And I'm using Rosemary and Company brushes. My surface here is Gamblin oil ground on Gator foam, which is like a really dense foam board. That's what I've got here. Yeah, so I'm just working on some of these color variations. And now I'm going to go into the lights, and I kind of have this yellowish tone overall, but there's a lot of really nice variety where some areas get more olive and more blue in some places. So I'm going to try to play up on some of those variations, and we'll see if we can bring out even more form here, okay? So I'm going to get a little smaller brush, and I'm going to come into my light skin color and a little bit more white, yellow ochre, and green, which is the black. And there's just a few areas that have a really nice olive tone to them that I'm going to try to get in here. And I'm looking right through here. Okay, right through there. Okay, I'm going to go a little darker with that. So I'm going to add a little bit of my darker olive color here and some transparent oxide red. And just right in here, this is a place where the lighter tone is kind of blending right into the halftone. And then I see that color on the side of the face here as well. Although I don't want to go quite as dark there. So I'm going to go back to this original light value. And you'll notice that I'm painting it just right into that same original pile of light skin color to make sure that I don't alter the value too much. Just helps me to see those colors right side by side on my palette before I put them up on the painting. So I have an idea that I'm keeping the same value, but just changing the color a little bit.
Why do you paint on a foam board instead of canvas?
Well, I vary a lot, so I do paint on canvas quite a bit actually, but the foam board we started using for plein air and studies mainly because it's so lightweight, and particularly when we're flying, if we need a bunch of panels, it's it keeps us from having to pay those overweight baggage fees. And if you're out plein airing and you've got your panels in a backpack, it's just a lot easier to carry those lightweight panels. So I use them for studies mainly.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay, and then on the cheek there's definitely a part that gets a little bit more pink. So just adding some more red and white to make it a little bit more pinkish. And I'm just looking right in here, but you notice I'm still keeping it about the same value. And I notice a little bit more of that color right here on the nose. So when I mix up these little variations of, more olive, more red, and so forth. I try to look for other areas where I can add them just to save time a little bit. Okay, there's also some areas that go cooler, and for that, I'm just going to start adding some of the black into my skin tone. And once again, the black does have a bit of blue pigment, this ivory black. And so in particular, when you put it next to these warmer skin tones, I mean, that actually it's a gray for sure, but it's almost starting to look a little bit more on the bluish side. And where I see that cooling skin tone is right here, right on the edge before it goes into shadow. And that's very typical of a lot of different subjects, really any subject, where right before going into the shadow, you'll have some extreme temperature shifts a lot of times, not everywhere, but I see it right there around the eye, and I see it right in here as well. So let's get a little bit of that, and it's pretty good approximation of the gray hair, to be honest. So I'm just going to add a little bit more right there while I'm at it.
Adam, do you prefer to use or do portraits with photos, or do you do live models?
Yeah, I like to work from life as much as I can. And so when you're doing a portrait, you'll typically have, just a limited amount of time to capture the person from life. But if I'm doing a portrait commission, for example, it's a big time investment where I know I'm going to be spending hours and hours on it. And so I'll certainly do an extensive photo shoot. I'll take, as many photos as I need to, a couple hundred photos or whatever. But I always try to insist anytime that I can to paint the subject, paint the person from life, even if I have just like 3 hours or 2 hours or however much time to capture them from life. Because when you can capture them from life, then you can capture the subtle relationships of value, those relationships of dark and light, as well as the subtle nuances of color that the camera just can't capture. So I very much rely on those photos later for particularly the drawing. And if I'm trying to fine tune the likeness and stuff, those photos are essential. But I'll still keep my life study on hand for mixing my color, particularly the little subtle nuances that the camera doesn't capture, as well as these relationships of dark and light. Finish by like 8:45 or so, and then we'll do some questions and answers. Does that sound about right, Jeff?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
Okay.
And also, I've already asked Adam to, uh, he probably won't be able to finish this tonight, but he will finish it after we get off here. And then he will send me a photo of the finished piece that then we can add to this video, and also will circulate to the members or get in the news magazine or newsletter or something like that. So,
All right, let's see if I can. Just restarting my camera. Well, we'll see. I'll check on the phone later. Sometimes it acts up a little bit, but this is the important part, that you see the painting, right? You don't really need to see me. So let's see. I'm gonna keep going with the portrait. Right now, I'm starting to get these little variations of color, and I don't want to get too detailed too fast before I block in the whole thing. And so why don't I switch gears, and I'd like to get some of the shadows in the shirt. And then it'll be kind of like the face, where I started out with just one light value and one dark value. I'm going to try to do something similar on the shirt there, just for the sake of getting the painting blocked in as much as I can. So I'm going to keep with the same brush, and you'll notice when you squint down that the shadow under the collar there is certainly darker than the white, but it's nowhere near as dark as these darkest darks on his neck. So I want to keep all those things in the right relationship. And that shadow is also warm. We've got cool light from, there was a window, and I was also using cool artificial lights as well. And so that produced warmer shadows. And so I'm starting out with the white and I'm making a darker gray, but I'm trying to keep it warmer on the warmer side. So you'll see I'm adding a little bit of yellow ochre here just to keep it nice and warm. It looks like it kind of has an olive tone to my eye. So I'm doing both the yellow and the black, which is giving me that olive color. And let's see what this looks like. It's going to come right through here. And I'm squinting down, and that's really not dark enough. That might work pretty well for some of these halftones, I think, but that's not dark enough to be the shadow there. So I'm going to add a little bit more black, a little bit more of this olive color, maybe even a touch of the transparent oxide red. I want to keep this nice and warm. Let me come back here. I'm going to scrape off that color because that wasn't right. And now when I put the new color on, it won't mix as much with that underneath color. A little more yellow ochre, a little more black. And let's see what we've got here. That's better. That's better. I think that could work as a shadow. Now I'm squinting down and I'm trying to see where else do I have that value. Now it's not really showing up because I happen to have the same value as the that initial tone on my panel, but just bear with me. I just want to get that color on there and see maybe a few other indications of it here and there. Okay, now when I squint down, clearly the brightest part of the shirt and really of the whole piece is this part of the collar right there. And the rest of the shirt is just not as bright as that white because this plane of that collar is facing the light source more directly, whereas the rest of the shirt is angled away a little bit. So I want to be mindful of that as I'm blocking in. And I'm going to come back here and just, I started out with a big old hunk of white before, and that's what I'm going to do again, but I'm just going to darken it just a little bit with a touch of black, just a tiny bit, to make it a little bit dimmer than that initial white that I got on there. And I'm squinting down and I'm trying to ask myself, what are the parts that have this lighter tone and which parts are actually in shadow? So by the time I get into these peripheral elements, they can be a lot looser. And that's really the style that I enjoy, is to paint more loose and impressionistic. And so I like to use the largest brushes that I can. And the more that I get into the periphery of the painting, I like to use larger strokes, bigger brushes, and so forth. Okay, there's a little bit of a darkening on the collar as it curls over. And then we've got a little bit of light right here that catches. And that follows down this way as well, just right down like that. And the further that I get away from the face, I can afford to be a little bit more loose and impressionistic with it. I don't have to be quite so exacting. Yeah, I'm just getting rid of that bunch of paint right there and squinting down at the subject, even squinting down at my painting a little bit. There's a nice olive, it's not a shadow, but it's kind of like a halftone that runs right under the collar. Right now you're just seeing the tone of the canvas, but I'm going to go a little, oops, got too much black there. That's going to be too dark. I just want to go a little bit darker than that pure white, but make it kind of an olive color. That's what I'm seeing with the black and yellow. Maybe something like this, and squinting down to try to see the shape and the value, and it's just right through there. That's going to be too warm. I want it, it's a little cooler, so I'm just going to add a little more black to this. And it goes right through. Ah, got a little bit of that pure black. So see how that was giving me a dark streak in there. I didn't want that, but just a little bit right through here. Okay, and I didn't get that exactly the way I wanted it, but it gives a little bit of definition to that collar. So now I'm literally just going to take my finger and bring that down into that darker shadow underneath. Gives a little bit more definition there. It's not exactly literal to what's there, but I think that gets the point across. And then I'm just softening that edge with my pinky right there. Okay, now I've got a ton of paint gobbed up on my brush, so I'm just gonna wipe that off real good. I'm getting a nice clean paper towel. There we go. Okay. All right, so again, I'm trying to block in the whole thing as much as I can. I want to get maybe a little bit of that background in, and there's a lot of red in the background. He's got that kind of cherry wood or whatever that is, that bookcase behind him, and so there's a lot of reddish brown. I think it's nice, and I think that would bring some nice color into the scene. So instead of just going black, what we're seeing in the photo right here, I'm going to go with like a dark red. And it'll be a little bit more red than the skin tone that I've got on his face, I think. I think that's what I'm envisioning that I think will look good. So coming back to the palette, it's getting pretty messy, so this is probably a good time for me to organize a little bit. So bear with me here, and I do this periodically when I run out of room, because if you don't, the new colors will tend to mix with the old colors, and you just kind of end up with mud a lot of times. So what I'm going to do is take similar colors and just kind of mix them all together. I can use these neutral tones here and there in my painting. So all these grays, I'm just kind of smushing them all together. Anything that's kind of similar. That. And then I am going to keep a few key mixtures like the shadow of the skin, and I'll leave that green right there. And then just going to clean off that little bit and move this portion of the skin over. So I've got my dark, middle, and my light skin right there. And then all of this stuff, I'm just going to mix together into a big batch of neutral nothing that I'll probably dip into here and there as I go along. It's still useful to me, so I'm not just going to throw it away. So I'll just push it over to the side. And now I've got a nice big area where I can work. Okay, so I've got all the excess paint scraped off, and then I just take my paper towel, and I might even venture to use just a touch of Gamsol just to make it nice and clean, but not very much. So I'm squeezing off my paper towel here, and I just want enough to lift up the paint. But when I go on top of the surface, I don't want there to be too much Gamsol that's going to make my paint soupy. So I do that, and then I just take a clean part of my paper towel and I wipe it off real good. So hopefully I don't have too much Gamsol residue on there, but this just makes the surface a little cleaner. Okay.
How will you get it blue enough for the eyes with the limited palette?
Yeah, so I should have brought up the larger portrait I did of this guy, because he was actually wearing blue jeans, and it's pretty amazing that just with the black and the white of the Zorn palette, you can get something that looks quite blue. And if I remember right, that's all I used for his blue jeans was just the black and the white. So right there, it's a very cool gray, but see how it's kind of blue. And when you put it in context with some of these more orangey colors, it looks blue in comparison. So yeah, I think you'll be surprised when I get that color in it'll look blue compared to the surrounding colors. All right, so I'm gonna mix up some red and black here. And I'm trying to get a value that I think will work. I think we're going to do something that's maybe just a touch darker than the shadow of the skin. So just a lot of red with a little bit of the black. Maybe something like that. In fact, I'm really getting a lot of black in that mixture. So I'm going to push that to the side because I really don't want it quite that dark. And let me get out some more red. I also need to resupply my white. Okay, so here's my white. Make sure I got plenty of that. And red as well. Okay. There we go. This time I'm just going to start with the red and add little bits of the black so it doesn't get too dark, okay? That's more like what I had in mind. And I'm just going to try this out. I think this is probably going to be too strong of a color, but then again, maybe it'll make a splash. We'll see. I'm going to use that large mongoose brush again and get a bunch of that on my brush and maybe just a little bit of my medium as well to make it spread real easy. And I'm just going to come in here. Oh no, I like this. That's not too strong red for my taste, at least. That's about what I had in mind. And then I'm just going to use this color to carve into some of these other shapes to start to establish things. Get a little bit more of that red on my brush. Come in here like that. And like this. There we go. I think that makes kind of a bold statement and brings some nice color into the scene here. Okay. And now that I have that strong color in there, why don't I get this one that has more of the black, and just in a few places on the far outer edges, I'm going to go a little darker. So it'll blend just a little darker as it gets farther out. And by having this dark background, this is going to help him to really pop out from that. You know, before a lot of his skin color was real similar to the value of that tone, that original tone that I've got. But now that I'm getting something darker back there, he's going to start to pop out from that. So a lot of people ask me about backgrounds and how should they select the right background for the subject. And my first thing that I tell them is value contrast. So if you have a darker subject, a lot of times you want to put them on a lighter background, and vice versa. If you have a lighter subject, a lot of times it's a good idea to put them on a darker background. So whatever you can do to make that subject pop, and see how he just comes forward once I start adding that darker tone back there. And I'm going to keep this part nice and loose and brushy just for some visual interest. Maybe I'll come back to that red color and just reestablish that in a few places. Oh, I cut into his ear a little bit too much there. Okay. Some of that red is picking up in his shirt a little bit too. So I'm going to want to incorporate some of those colors in there. So I might come back here and borrow from the skin color a little bit. and give it a bit of that influence of the red. And then come in here for the collar. And that shadow under the collar has kind of a reddish feel to it because it's just reflecting the reds in the background, or in the environment, I should say. Yeah. All right, now I'm going to come in here and get just a little bit of reddishness to the shadow of his shirt. And I think you can see that if you look for it, the little bit of red in some of these shadows. Once again, it's just reflecting some of the color elsewhere in the picture. It's just a nice touch to bring a little bit more realism to the scene and tie the strong red that I have in the background in with the subject. So you're usually not going to have any one color in isolation. You're going to want to usually echo it in other places in your scene. Okay, and then I'm going to get a little small brush, and just right in the deepest part of that, I'm going to go a little darker and warmer. Let's see, maybe with the black and the yellow ochre and a bit of transparent oxide red. I'm going to go warm for this little deepest shadow under the collar. And it's going to be right there. Going to go a little darker with that still. There we go. Just a little bit of a payoff to give that last little bit of depth right in there. Let me take another stab at it because I think I got it a little dark and a little cool. There, I'm happier with that. I'm just gonna introduce a little bit of that mixture right in this shadow because I still feel it's just a little bit light. There we go. Yeah, happier with that now too. Yeah. Now right on the edge of that shadow on the shirt, kind of in the halftone area, it is going to go cooler. And I'm looking right here. Similar to how it went cooler right before going into the shadow right there. So same kind of principle where under the cool light, a lot of times you'll see the cool in these halftones here. So I'm just trying to introduce those as well. That'll help to give that illusion of cool light. And I got a little bit of paint messed up into the white, but that's okay. That won't hurt anything. I'm going to put that cool transition right here as well. Okay, and I'm almost done with the shirt and the background, and then we can get back into the face. But it's just really nice to block in the whole scene, and then you can have a lot better idea visually of where the painting is headed. All right, I'll just soften this edge right here. Okay. All right, cool. Okay, back to the face. We've got some work to refine those features, and that's what I want to be working on next. Before I do though, I noticed that I never blocked in that part of the hair right here. So let me see if I can get just a basic tone that will approximate that color. it's pretty dark, about the same value as the shadow for the skin, but a lot grayer. But it's definitely a warm gray, picking up some of the red from the environment. I've got a healthy dose of black, yellow ochre, and red in this mixture. And I don't have much paint there, so I'm going to add a bit of the medium to make it hopefully stretch a little farther. And it's going to come in here, and I'm using my large mongoose, very soft mongoose brush. And I'm squinting down to try to see the shapes and the values. There we go. And we'll introduce just a little bit of it on this side where there's a touch of shadow. Okay, I'm also trying to make sure that I back up for my work. I'm just not too close to it. That's always real important to be able to see the issues and correct them as I go. You'll also notice that I'm going to start softening edges more. So like right here, as the scalp kind of fades into the shadow, I'll want to go a little softer. And in various other parts, I'll be doing that as well. I can, if I take this mongoose brush and clean it off and dry it off really well, it's a very good blending brush where, you know, in the beginning, all of these shapes are very blocky and graphic looking. And now I can start with very large strokes, as much as I can, to soften those edges and make that form look more three-dimensional. So I always say that, you know, value is one factor of that form that you want it to look three-dimensional, but value also needs a sidekick. And that sidekick is edge. And so value and edge work together to really completely show the volume and the three-dimensional mass of your subject. So you can use both of those principles together to really give a three-dimensional look to your subjects. And I know I'm throwing out a lot of these terms here, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them, but I also try to just be, you know, sensitive to people who might not know those terms. So I'm trying to define them as I go. But I also do want to mention that I have my online course where I go really in depth with all these principles. So if it feels like I'm going really fast, you know, it's just anytime I do a demo, I try to cram in as much information as I can and hopefully show as much of my process as I can. But if anyone is interested in a little slower pace and more in depth, I can talk about that course a little bit later. But I'm just trying to mix up these slightly darker tones. These are basically like the half tones of the hair. And so I started with just two values, again, just like I did for the skin, darker and lighter. And now I'm kind of getting into the half tones here. And trying to get that stuff in. And then I just want to transition from that really dark shadow and gradually come out from that as the hair emerges into the light. I'm keeping all these edges in the hair very, very soft. And that's going to be real important for showing the texture of the hair. And this brush, this mongoose brush, is really good for showing those, for getting those soft edges. Like I mentioned before, it's not the only kind of brush for this. You can use a sable brush or really any kind of soft hair brush. Sorry, I think I forgot to switch to my palette cam. I'm just adding a little bit more white to this mixture. Right in here. Just a little bit more light, a little bit lighter tone right there. And just keeping that outer edge real soft so it looks like hair. Okay, so now I'm just wiping off this brush real good because I want to go into my dark mixture again. And I was just painting with something that was very light. So I don't want the light to mix with the dark too much. So you'll notice I did rinse my brush a little bit in the Gamsol just to make it nice and clean. And now I'm just squeezing the hairs real good. And I'm going to get a nice, clean paper towel. I'll make sure my gloves are clean too, because they're getting pretty messy. Okay, but I just don't want any of this white to get into that nice dark mixture that I have. All right, there's that. And then coming back here, I just need to reestablish this dark a little bit better and make it gradually blend into the lighter tone. So it looks like that hair is emerging into the light right there. See how I just blended that? By carrying the darker tone into the lighter tone a little bit. And it just gives that effect that it's gradually coming into the light. I'll do the same thing over here and trying to squint down and see what's going on there. Like that. And that. And then I want a little bit of a softer edge right there on the edge of the scalp. That might seem like a firm edge when you look at it, but when you squint down at the scene or at the whole portrait and compare it to some of the other really hard edges, like right here on his collar, it's just not that sharp. So I want to be mindful of those types of things. Got a little bit of a darker part right there that defines the edge of his jaw and makes it separate from the ear. Carry that down a little bit like this. Okay. Just want to establish the shape of the eye socket real good before I go in with any detail in the eyes, okay? So now I'm going to get a little bit of a smaller brush, and I'm going to take a stab at the structure of the eye there. And what I do is I squint way down because you don't want to try to paint every little detail in the eye, and at least the way that I paint, which is more impressionistically. I'm trying to look for how do those shapes start to merge together when I squint down, and then I try to paint it that way to just make it look more impressionistic, which in my opinion actually makes it look more realistic. Okay, but before I get into a bunch of detail with the eye, I do need to make sure that the surrounding forms are accurate. So for example, I want to get this little part right here. There's a little bit more of a form on the brow, and I'm trying to squint down to get the eyebrow shape, and we're getting into some olive tones there, so a little bit more yellow and black. And where I'm seeing that is just right there, and that's actually coming across quite cool. So I'm going to start warming it up just a little bit by borrowing from some of the skin tone. And then it comes up like this way. And when you squint down, that eyebrow is not too much darker than the surrounding skin tone. So I'm adding a little bit of, oh, sorry, I've got my picture covering it. I've got just a little bit of yellow ochre and white to lighten that and make that eyebrow hopefully not too dark right in here. It just goes right like that. Okay. Got that still just a little bit dark. Let me come in here and modify that with some skin tone around it. That, okay. Then we're going to need to go lighter still for some of these highlights. So you'll notice there's a bit of a highlight that's catching right there. And it's quite cool. So I'm going to add some black to it, which is essentially my blue when I'm using the Zorn palette. And that just needs to go right about there. Need to go darker with that though. Right about in there. There we go. That's better. Nice cool highlight there. And that is pretty similar to the blue highlight in the eye. I'm just going to get a touch tiny indication of that right there. Okay, now I'm squinting down at this and I want to get I think the thing I need to do next is that little dark shape that's the corner of the eye. So up until this point, I've been using mostly mid to large brushes, but now I really do need a smaller one. And so this is actually a number 0, and it's a little ivory brush. The Ivory line from Rosemary and Company's brushes is a synthetic bristle, and I like them because they go to a nice fine edge, so you can get little precise shapes. And I'm squinting down, I'm trying to pay attention to that value. It looks really dark, but it's a very tiny shape, so it's going to tend to take on, it's going to tend to look darker than it really is. So I don't want to paint it too dark. Let's see, I need to back up from this to make sure that I have it placed accurately. And I'm going to come out a little bit more like this, and then there's just a little bit more of an indication of the upper lid like that. I've got to have a little bit more of a downward slant to it. There we go. Now we need to come in with my skin color again, maybe this mid-tone, and get a little bit of an angled stroke right there. My head was probably covering that, but I was just adding a little bit of light in between those two dark shapes. And now I'll try to reestablish that dark shape a little bit better. Okay. This needs to slope down just a little bit more like that. I brought that a little too far to the right, so I'm just going to take some of this lighter tone that's right there and push it back to the left. And same thing for that little passage of light right through there. Got to use a little skinny brush for these movements. Okay, now I'll hang on to that same brush, but I'm going to go a little cooler for the white of the eye. Now, the white of the eye, one big mess up that a lot of people do, and I mess up on it too sometimes, is to make the whites of the eyes too light. Our mind tells us that that part needs to be really light, but once again, you always want to use the squinting as your guide. So if you squint down at the white of the eye and you compare it to the lightest light of the shirt, I think you'll see as soon as you do that, that the white of the eye is not that light and bright. So I'm basically painting at the same value as the surrounding skin colors, but I'm going with a grayer version of that color. And that'll usually be the ticket. Okay, now I need a little bit of indication of the lower lid right underneath that. So I'm gonna come into, it's really this halftone value, but it needs to go redder. So I'm adding some more red here. And there's just a little bit of that shape right there. And I'm backing up to see if that's about in the right place. I'm gonna need to bring this darker shape down like that. Okay, and then we just need a little bit more light on that lower lid, and I think that'll look a lot better. So I'm going to come in here and use this skin tone mixture there and get that lower lid just a little bit lighter to make it look like there's more light on it. That'll really help that roundness of the eye, I think. And then I've got it a little bit dark right there, so I'm just going to kind of dab that lighter tone over top. There we go. Okay, now it looks like his eye is looking to our left a little bit too much. And I think all we need is just that that bluish iris to bring it so that it looks like his eye is facing us more. So going back to the question that someone asked about how to get the blue of the eye, this always amazes me. Like I said, I painted this guy in a 3/4 pose, and he was wearing blue jeans, and I'm pretty sure that I only used my black paint. It's been some years ago, about almost 10 years ago now, so I don't remember for sure, but I'm almost positive that I used the Zorn palette for it. Now here is just black and white, and this might be too cold, actually, believe it or not, for the color of his eye, because there's actually, they're actually a little bit blue-green, and so I might actually have to add a bit of yellow to this to make it a little bit more green. But this is just straight black and white, and let's see what it looks like. Yeah, that color, I think it looks nice. It's definitely not as greenish as what he actually has, but it's a nice color. And maybe if I just add just a touch of yellow ochre, it'll be just right. But I mean, if you actually used blue paint for these eyes, it would be way too blue. Be way too blue. And same thing for the blue jeans. You know, I've painted blue jeans at other times, and I've started with a big pile of ultramarine blue paint, and then only to find that I had to gray it down a ton with other colors. So I'm actually a lot closer to the color of blue jeans if I were to just start with black and white. And then if I need to go a little bluer, I could always add a bit of blue. But in the case of these eyes here, I don't need to go any bluer with these really. So I added a bit of yellow, and now I'm just going to come in here and establish that. There we go. And now I'm going to come into that really dark color. In fact, I could almost use just pure black, but like this color right here on the corner of my screen, maybe I'll just add a bit more black to that. And right here, I can establish the pupil of the eye right here. There. Okay, and I'll step back from it. And now that I have that in there, that's very dark. So I'm almost wanting to lighten it just a little bit. It looks a little stark. Let me do something like that. And then now that I have that, I see that I do need a darker shadow for the upper lid that comes down that way. And maybe I need to connect it in over on the right-hand side as well. Just like that. Okay. There we go. And I'm squinting down at my subject always. And, you know, a lot of times you'll see details that you think are really important. But as soon as you squint down, if those details start to fade away, it's a pretty good indication that they're probably not that important. And so you can get by not painting them. And in my opinion, it gives just that much more mystery and intrigue to the scene if you paint it the way that you see it while you squint. Okay. All right. So I think the form of the eye is reading okay. And I just want to reshape that a little bit. And then the edges of the pupil of the eye are they're very sharp right now. And so I want to go ahead and soften those. I'm going to get this little, well, it's a medium-sized mongoose brush. Actually, it's Rosemary's Eclipse series, which is a synthetic mongoose substitute that I would recommend if you're interested. And first I need to go a little darker on the the left-hand rim of the iris like that. And then I'm just going to use this brush to hopefully soften the edges of the pupil just a little bit, because the sharpest edge in the eye is definitely that little highlight. And compared to that, the edge of the pupil is not as sharp. So once again, I'm always using these comparative analyses to figure out the values and the edges and everything. Got to raise that shape just a little bit so it looks like his eye is a little bit more open. Okay, that. And then I'm going to, let's here, back up from my work. Got to shape this a little bit better right there and bring the iris over to the right just a little bit. And then coming back in here for the white of the eye, got to carve in a little bit on the lower right-hand corner to shape that a little better. Then I'm just going to go nice and soft in there by kind of dabbing at it. And now, hopefully, I've set myself up to put that nice highlight in. And I'm going to do it with my palette knife because it'll allow me to lay on a little thread of paint that is a really sharp edge, much more than what I could do with my brush. Now, again, I'm squinting down, and this highlight is nowhere near as bright as the white of the collar. So I've got to be mindful of that and not overdo it, or else it's going to look like he's shooting lasers out of his eyes or something. So I want to keep this in reserve, but it's got to be just a little bit lighter than the tones I was just working with. So maybe something like this. I can put it next to the color of the pupil on the palette here and kind of estimate if I've got it. I'm going to start out a little darker than I think I need to because I can always go lighter, but if I put it on too light, then I just have to scrape it off and start over. So let's see what this looks like. And if I need to go lighter, I can. So I've got a little goober of it on the edge of my palette knife, and that allows me to just lay it on there. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter with it for just one little spot. And I'm just going to put that right here. There. Okay. So there's his eye. All right, I've got about 10 minutes, and I'm going to try to give a little bit more definition to some of these areas. You know, like Jeff said, in an hour and a half, you know, there's only so much finish that I'm able to achieve here, but hopefully I'm showing you at least the stages of my process to, you know, to help you make decisions in your own work. And again, in my portrait course, I have my online course, I have full demos where you get to see everything start to finish. You know, I just have a little bit more time, so I'm able to develop that. So I'll show that in a minute here. I have a 10% discount that I created for members of the Lake County Art League. So if anybody is interested in digging deeper, you enjoyed the principles I was talking about here tonight and would like some more of that, I'll share that at the end here in case you're interested. I want to go sharper with the edge right here. There. And then I'm going to take that soft brush again, and I'm going to soften some of these real graphic shapes that I've got to make them look more rounded right here. And the bridge of the nose is more of a cylindrical shape. So if I can just kind of blend those shapes that I've got, it'll help with the form so much more. So that's what I'm going to work on here in the last little bit. I think I can do without a lot of the superfluous details if I just soften some of the edges. As a general rule, I like to have more detail in the lights than I do in the shadows. And because, well, it's for a couple of reasons. Because the eye will tend to focus more on the stuff that's in the light.
Are you able to zoom in on the eye?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the camera's going to get shaky, so you might want to close your eyes a minute if you have motion sickness, but give me just 1 second.
Oh, that's much better. Thank you.
Get that focus. There, you like that?
That's much better. Yeah, you can see the shine.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to zoom back out now so we can see the whole.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I can give a high-res photo at some point in the future too. Let me make sure my focus is good again here. Okay. Okay, I'm just cleaning off my brush real good because I'm going between light and dark areas of the painting, and I don't want to mess up my paint too much. I'm gonna do like that and that. Okay, now I just kind of want to focus on implying a little bit more finish. And then I will open it up for questions and answers. When I squint down, his white mustache really is not, it's just a little bit lighter than the skin tone there. So I'm sort of coming in here to this mess of gray that I've got, and I just want to go a little lighter with it. Maybe get just a little bit of the thinner of the medium. And let's see what happens if I just kind of get a little bit of that broken color on there to imply that he's got the, the mustache over top. I can do a little bit right here. See how it's not going on super flat, but it's kind of allowing some of the underneath layer to show through. And that's one of the things I really like to do with anything textured like hair and different types of subjects like that. And it'll give a little bit more suggested detail here without actually having to paint every hair. Let's see, where else do I want to do that? Maybe just a little bit right here. Okay, then I'll do the same thing, but I'm going to go a little bit lighter with it, a little lighter value. And that's what we've got as we're coming around here. I'm wiping off my brush real good, and I want to get more of a halftone version of that color. Right in here. Let's make it a little bit more of a skin tone because we've got skin popping through in that part. It's a very, very textural part right there. So maybe I'll even take the handle of my brush like I just showed right there. And I'm bringing back in this little ivory brush and just kind of messing it up, giving a little bit of broken color to imply the stubble that he's got going on right there. Okay, need a few dark accents to define the mouth a little bit better. I'm going to make that just a little bit lighter and very red. So adding a little bit more red, maybe a little bit of transparent oxide red to my mixture. And in these deep crevices, particularly when you're painting flesh, these deep crevices between the lips and the nostril and so forth are going to be very warm. And I've got a nice little sharp edge on the top of the nostril, but then on the right-hand side and on the left, it's a lot softer. Get the other one in there as well. Real subtle though. I don't want to overstate the nostrils at all. Got to make that one a little bit warmer. Bring up the corner of this mouth a little bit. It made him look pretty stern. Let's bring that up a little bit. He's got a pretty pleasant expression on his face in the photo. get a bristle brush and just, let's see, I want to use the one that I used for my shadow so I don't bring any stray light tones into it. Let's see if I've got a clean enough brush to do this. I'm just going to have to wipe this one off real good. Need that shadowed skin color again. And we'll just use that to push into that shadow color in the corner of his mouth. Then I'll get that dark accent color again, make it nice and warm. And come in here for the corner of the mouth once more. Yeah. Use the corner of my brush just to establish that lower lid going up into the white of the eye just a little bit right there, but all of this eye is really very much in shadow. So I just don't want to make it too bright, but there's enough of that eyeball that's sticking out or rounded toward us just a little bit, just enough to get another little highlight in there. And I want to be very, very careful with this one as well, because it's even dimmer than the other highlight, even though it looks very bright because it's surrounded by all that dark. But if I paint it as bright as I think it needs to go, once again, it's just going to look like a laser shooting out of his eye. So I've got to keep this very, very subtle. And when I squint down, the highlight starts to fade into the surrounding dark tones. So that tells me that it's not as bright as it looks at first glance. It's very cool in color, and I'm going to try this right here. Let me get that in there. We'll see if it looks right. Yeah. Okay, I think I could venture to go just a little bit lighter than that, but once again, I didn't want to start off too light. It's better to start off safe, a little darker than you think it needs to go. Okay, just a little bit of a glint in that other eye brings it to life. All right, well, it is 8:47, so I'm going to go ahead and I'll keep painting, but I'll shut my trap so you can ask your questions. So please go right ahead if anyone does have any questions, and let me know what's on your mind. Not everyone all at once, though.
I don't have a question, but I do just really appreciate the tutorial and you sharing your technique with us. So, I just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm enjoying it as well.
Oh, thank you. Good. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
The only question I really have kind of is that when you're blocking in all the shadow and light in the beginning,
Mhm.
it almost seemed like so much of it was so dark. I worry that like I'd get lost. Like, how do you avoid getting lost when there's so much like darkness at first, like if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Are you referring to the shadow side of the face?
Yeah.
And just it
Yes.
was a lot darker than you probably expected.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, my best advice there would be to trust your eye when you're squinting. And and I was noticing in the photo that when I squint down, I painted my darkest dark first. That was that one right there, inside the hair. And when you squint down, you notice that even part of the forehead kind of starts to blend into that shadow a little bit because it's so dark. So just you kind of learn with practice to trust the way that things look when you're squinting, and don't be afraid to go dark. That's really the key to well, yeah, it's value is the key for showing things that are three-dimensional and not flat. So I know that's kind of a big like mental hurdle to get over. But yeah, don't be afraid to go dark if something is actually shadowed and you're squinting down, and compared to the darkest darks, if it still looks dark, then go ahead and make that nice and dark and you'll get that nice shadow. And then by the time I get over here to the lights, well, now I'm comparing to my lightest light and noticing that the skin tone over here is just a little bit darker than the white. So all of these things are in comparison and in relationship to each other. So I hope that makes sense and answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
But I'm very impressed and amazed how you paint with such limited colors. Do you always limit yourself to this palette, or is that just for plein air and quick studies?
No, I don't. And for plein air, I would sometimes I do use a limited palette, but I'm using different versions of the primaries. So here I do have a red, yellow, and a blue being my black. And that works great for subjects like this that don't have a bright yellow or a bright blue. So if I'm outside, I will use like an ultramarine blue, a cadmium yellow, along with the cadmium red, so stronger colors. But so this is just the palette I use sometimes, and it's a very good palette for particularly portraits under cool light. It's really great for that. So um,
And then what was that
sometimes I do,
red that
sometimes I
you
don't.
added again? The dark red, what color? Something oxide.
Yeah, this is transparent oxide red, and it's like
Okay.
burnt sienna, but it's very dark and transparent and warm.
So how much more detail how far are you from being finished with this portrait?
Well, it kind of depends. If you look at my website, you'll find a variety of paintings in different levels of finish.
Mhm.
And so it kind of just depends. If I'm doing a commission portrait, a lot of times I'll bring that to a really high level of finish, a lot of detail and stuff. But if I'm doing a study like this, like I said, I am really attracted to paintings that have that look of immediacy and looseness. And so there's probably parts of this that I wouldn't take too much farther. So it really
So,
just depends on what my goal is for that particular painting, and that will determine what level of finish I bring it to.
okay. Well, I mean, because that looks cool. I'm just bothered a little by the shirt. So you're gonna do more on the shirt? Or
Oh,
is
well,
that
a lot of this is really up to your taste as an artist. So I would not do a lot to the shirt because again, I like the looseness, and especially
okay?
because that's a peripheral element. I keep those peripheral elements looser than say the eye because I want to make it look like the viewer's focused there. And then in your peripheral vision, things tend to be a little bit more abstract. So I like that look, but certainly that's up to your taste and your preferences as an artist. So you could certainly bring your paintings to a higher level of finish. That's just what I like to do.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
How do you get yourself to become looser in the projects? It said I always end up getting mired in the minutia of the painting or of the people that I try to do.
Mhm.
And I know it limits me, but I don't. How do you get yourself out of that?
Well, yeah, It's a great question, and that's something that I worked really hard at because I was very detail oriented, and I wanted to get as much detail as I could in there. But I really enjoyed the loose paintings that I was seeing that some artists were doing, and I wanted to do that. So I kind of had to. There's a series of things that I wrote a blog post about. There's about 6 or 7 things that really helped me to paint more loosely. And a few of them I mentioned here. One of them is using a brush a little too big for the job. And so for a lot of this, I was just using a really large brush, and that forces you to not think about the detail too much, at least in the beginning. And so it's not until more in the end that I'm reaching for the smaller brush to get the little details in the eyes and so forth. So that's one thing, is simply using a larger brush. Another thing is making sure that you discipline yourself to back up from your work. So you notice that I'm standing right now, and if I'm sitting, I'm a lot less likely to back up from my work. So if I stand back several feet, and if my painting still makes sense and it reads visually, then I try to say, okay, that's good. I've got it good enough. When you're up close, you're going to find all kinds of little paint strokes and things that you might think you have to adjust. But if you really want your paintings to look loose, assess them from several feet away. And if they look good at, say, 10 feet away, then it's good enough. So those are some of the tips that I've used. And I do want to reiterate that this thing is really a matter of preference. And there's certainly nothing wrong with taking a painting to a high level of finish if you choose. So this is just one of those things where it's up to your personal preferences as an artist. A lot of my students do want to paint looser though. And so I share those tips with them. But there's nothing wrong with painting more tightly as well. Okay, I just wanted to go a little bit more reddish right there. And any more questions? Those are good ones. Try to get a few highlights in here with the last few minutes that I've got. Highlight on the lip, and I'm squinting down. I'm trying to see what is the strongest highlight on the skin. It's probably the one on the nose. So I just added a lot more white to my skin mixture there. And now I'll add just a little bit more yellow to it and kind of soften the edge of it just a bit. And we've got a nice highlight that comes in here and down here on the cheek a little bit. That's going to be, I think, an important one for showing the, the likeness and the form of his face here. So I want to make sure I get that in using that small number 0 ivory brush again. A little bit more of the highlights in to give just a little more dimension to the face there. That's a little bit too bright. Still a little bit too bright, but that's okay. I can kind of mix it with the rest of the tones around. There we go. And then there's just a few parts of the beard that are just catching a little bit more light than what I've got right through here.
Hey, Adam,
Yes.
we're gonna probably have to wrap this up in a couple minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for watching. It was a lot of fun. I am going to share, if you don't mind, just one quick thing here. I said I was going to share about my course. And so if anyone is interested in that, I just want to share this coupon code where you can save 10%. And let's see if I can figure out how to get it back up there again. There we go. Okay. The coupon code is thanks LCAL, because I appreciate you having me on. If anybody, if you enjoyed what I talked about here and you want to dig deeper into these principles, I've got that 10% coupon that I'd love to have you sign up if you're interested, and it's good through Wednesday. So tonight, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you can get that 10% off. And the course, basically, it contains everything I know about these fundamentals and about composition with the subject of portraits. So I just wanted to share that. If you want to go ahead and take a screen capture or something of that. But yeah, any other questions for me from you, Jeff, or anybody else?
No, I don't have anything.
No, just
All
thank
right.
you very
Just
much.
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was very
Yeah,
good.
thank you. It was
Yeah,
great.
thank you.
Good.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I
It was
had fun.
wonderful.
Yep.
So thank
Learned
you
a
so
lot.
much for having me, Jeff and Deb
Yeah,
and everybody else.
great.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank
Very
you.
nice demonstration.
Yeah, very
Okay.
good.
Glad to hear it. Good. Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.